Welcome to Russian History Retold, Episode 352, Leon Trotsky Revisited, Part 1. Last time, we covered the horrific Battle of Berlin, focusing on the human side of the last major battle and the European side of World War II. Today, we're going to re-examine the life and times of Leon Trotsky, and in today's episode, we will look at his younger years from his birth and what may have turned him into the revolutionary that he became in his family life, going all the way up to 1905 and the revolution of that year. In the next episode, we're going to have a special focus on the planning of his death, one ordered by his archenemy, Joseph Stalin. One thing I want to do with this series is to look deeper into the person, not just what they did historically. I originally did a 3-part series on Trotsky back in 2014, episodes 153 to 155. One of the reasons I decided to pick Trotsky as my topic today is because of the 2026 publication of one of the main sources for this episode, the book Death of Trotsky, The True Story of the Plot to Kill Stalin's Greatest Enemy by Josh Ireland. The other two sources I will lean on are Leon Trotsky, A Revolutionary's Life by Joshua Rubinstein, and The Prophet, which is an enormous book. It's about 1,300 pages, and it's by Isaac Deutscher. And so this is a 2-parter this time instead of a 3-parter because I want to really get to the person and not just the history of what he did over the years. I'd like to start with a quote from Rubinstein's book. Quote, "His years in exile, the outspoken criticism of Stalin, the fate of his 4 children, and his own assassination deserve more than grudging sympathy. Harassed, threatened, virtually defenseless, Trotsky became an all-too-human figure as both Soviet and Western political leaders scorned him. Trotsky, in turn, never disavowed his vocation to be a revolutionary. His courage and determination were as much as the wellspring of his allure as they were the source of his undoing. Once removed from power, Trotsky was not as much of a threat to Stalin as either the Kremlin feared or his followers believed. But he refused to renounce the revolution that first betrayed, then destroyed him. He could not renounce himself." To better understand Trotsky, we need to head back to his childhood as Lev Davidovich Bronstein. He was born to a quite wealthy family on November 11th, 1879. The wealth that his illiterate family accumulated, led by his father David, would make the future Leon Trotsky despise capitalism. He describes his father as the following, quote, "By indefatigable, cruel toil that spared neither himself nor others, and by hoarding every penny, my father rose in the world. The land, the cattle, the poultry, the mill took all my parents' time. There was none left for us. The seasons succeeded one another, and waves of farm work swept over domestic affection. There was no display of tenderness in our family." 2 men were considered by Trotsky to be the most influential in his early life. The first, Ivan Gribine, was a mechanic who taught the young boy, now 8, how the machinery on his father's farm worked, along with the tools necessary to keep them running. Trotsky wrote about him glowingly in his memoir. Now, according to Rubinstein, quote, "This may have been a sincere claim, but we cannot help but wonder whether it suited Trotsky to place a working man at the center of his upbringing in a household that was otherwise marked by middle-class, bourgeois values, and a father who Trotsky believed was capable of exploiting workers and peasants alike." The other person who helped shape little Lev's life was an older cousin, Moisey Schwepensner. The two took to each other almost immediately. Lev traveled with Moisey and his wife Fanny to their home in Odessa, continue his education. They were critical in helping develop Trotsky's intellect and his love of reading. It was in Odessa, surprisingly, that Trotsky began to reject, in part, his Jewish heritage. Never truly religious, Lev still had to deal with the prevalent anti-Semitism sentiment in Russia. He would call it national inequality instead of anti-Semitic prejudice. Now, Odessa itself was home to 100,000 Jews, but it would be a target of a May of 1881 pogrom. This outburst of government-aided anti-Semitism was the second largest behind the October 1905 pogrom. Still, over 2 million Jews left Russia in response to the 1881 pogrom. When Lev was finally accepted into St. Paul's Realschule, it was obvious to most that he was the most talented student there. In second grade, Trotsky would get into trouble for booing and hissing at an unpopular teacher. He would be suspended for the rest of the year. But he would learn a valuable lesson, as he would say that the school had 3 groups, quote, the talebearers and the envious at one pole, the frank, courageous boys at the other, and the neutral, vacillating mass in the middle. These 3 groups never quite disappeared, even during the years that followed. Lev's change into Leon Trotsky would begin in 1896, his last year at St. Paul's. As he put it in his memoir, he began to swing, quote, leftward with such speed that it even frightened some. Lev would begin to read banned newspapers and books. Now, there were 2 philosophers that piqued his interest, and they were both British, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. But the one book that really changed his point of view was Nikolai Chernyshevsky's What is to be Done. At the time, Trotsky was not yet a Marxist. Instead, he was considered a Narodnik, which is also known as a revolutionary, agrarian, socialist populist. He would meet, and at first, denounce his future wife, Alexandra Sokolovskaya. Over time, though, she would convince him to follow the writings and ideals of Karl Marx. But, according to Nikita Khrushchev in his book Khrushchev Remembers, he writes, in his written testament, Lenin says that Trotsky had never been a Marxist, while Stalin possessed the necessary qualities of a real Marxist. But Lenin also said that Stalin was intolerant and vengeful. In 1897, Trotsky would begin to organize workers, at first in the town of Nikolaev. He would create a newspaper called Nashe Delo, or Our Cause. He would help to create unions to ask for higher wages and better working hours. As Grigory Ziv would write about Trotsky, quote, our group was the first social democratic organization in Nikolaev. We were so excited by our success that we were in a state of chronic enthusiasm. For the major part of these successes, we were undoubtedly indebted to Bronstein, whose energy was inexhaustible and whose many-sided inventiveness and untiring drive knew no bounds. Lev Bronstein was only 18 years old when this occurred. One question I've been asked more than a few times is, when and how did he go from Lev Bronstein to Leon Trotsky? Many of the sources I've reviewed agree that he began using the name primarily during the summer of 1902, when he escaped from Tsarist exile in Siberia using a forged passport bearing the name Trotsky. He continued to use this name permanently thereafter, and it became the name under which all of his major political writings and activities were known. Now, there is a theory that the name Trotsky was that of a prison guard. Whether it's true or not, that's pretty hard to tell. Alexandra Lvovna Sokolovskaya, despite her initial spat with Trotsky, would marry him in 1900. Trotsky would go on to say something about his wife. Quote, Alexandra Lvovna had one of the most important positions in the South Russian Workers' Union. Her utter loyalty to socialism and her complete lack of any personal ambition gave her an unquestioned moral authority. The work that we were doing bound us closely together, and so, to avoid being separated, we had married in the transfer prison in Moscow. They would have 2 children who would precede the couple in death, Zinaida Volkova and Nina Nevelson. Nina would die of tuberculosis in 1928, and Zinaida would commit suicide on January 5, 1933. Sokolovskaya would blame Trotsky for their daughter's suicide because of his coldness toward her. Alexandra and Lev would be sent into exile in Siberia in 1902 along with their 2 children. As I mentioned before, Trotsky would escape and leave his family. In 1905, Alexandra would return to Moscow, only to be exiled again shortly after returning. She would remain there until 1917. They would get divorced, though, in 1902, allowing Trotsky to remarry the following year to Natalia Ivanovna Sudova, a Russian revolutionary who would write about cultural matters pertaining to Marxism. She would bear him 2 sons, Lev Zhidov and Sergei Zhidov. They would take their mother's surname to supposedly protect them. Still, it wouldn't save either from Stalin's grasp during the Great Purge, as Lev would be assassinated, according to some sources, in 1938, and Sergei would die in 1937 under suspicious circumstances while in prison. Alexandra would also be shot on April 29, 1938. Natalia Sudova was described this way by Max Eastman, a prominent American radical intellectual, editor of The Masses and the Liberator, who would later become a leading U.S. critic of the Soviet Union after having lived there from 1922 to 1924. Quote, she was a strong-hearted girl with high cheekbones and eyes a little sad. A girl of noble birth who had been a rebel since childhood. Natalia had been expelled from a boarding school for persuading her class to read revolutionary material and skip chapel services. She fit right in with Trotsky. Eastman was an interesting character as he befriended Trotsky and turned against Stalin when he wrote the book When Lenin Died. While Trotsky and Sudova were in Western Europe, the pogrom against the Jews in Kishinev occurred in 1903. It was a 3-day bloodbath where 50 Jews were murdered and hundreds more injured. The mob destroyed approximately 700 homes in their orgy of violence. The Minister of the Interior in Russia at the time was the deeply anti-Semitic Vyacheslav von Plehve. He viewed the violence as a stern warning for Jews not to join the revolutionary causes that many were flocking to. Von Plehve would admonish a group of Jews that came to visit him instead of listening to their pleas for help. During the summer of 1903, Theodor Herzl, one of the founders of modern Zionism, visited St. Petersburg to talk to Plehve and Sergei Witte. There, Plehve would admit that the policies of the Tsarist regime were driving Jews toward revolutionary causes. Quote, if I were a Jew, I too would probably be an enemy of the government. Trotsky would have none of Herzl's pleas for Jews to abandon revolution and turn to Zionism. He would call Herzl a shameless adventurist and repulsive figure. Many of his fellow Marxists at the time, like Lenin, Martov, and Plekhanov, agreed. The Second Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party was held from July 30th to August 23rd, 1903, starting in Brussels, Belgium, for the first 7 days, and ending in London, England, due to pressure from the Russian government. This was a monumental meeting, as it marked the split of the Social Democrats into the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. Initially, Trotsky would side with the Mensheviks, But the following year, he would declare that he was non-factional. Now, in 1905, Trotsky would become one of the chairmen of the St. Petersburg Soviet. He would begin, in 1904, to deviate from the positions that Lenin would take, especially when it came to the idea of a centralized party, making it somewhat difficult for the common worker to join. Trotsky would denounce Lenin, comparing him to Robespierre and openly calling him, quote, the party disorganizer. That would begin to change on January 9th, 1905, the day known to history as Bloody Sunday. While Lenin was unprepared for the event, Trotsky, strangely, was not. He wrote while living in Geneva, Switzerland, quote, before January 9th, our demand for a republic seemed fantastic, doctrinaire, and disgusting to all liberal pundits. One day of revolution was enough. One magnificent contact between the Tsar and the people was enough for the idea of a constitutional monarchy to become fantastic, doctrinaire, and disgusting. The real monarch has destroyed the idea of the monarch. The revolution has come, and she has put an end to our political childhood. Trotsky knew he had to return to Russia. When he left it 2.5 years earlier, he wasn't very well known. When he returned, oh, he was. Lenin and Martov were too into their Menshevik versus Bolshevik argument to return, but Trotsky knew that this was an opportunity to grab. Unfortunately for him, his wife would be arrested and sent to jail for 6 months, then to Tver to live under police supervision. With that, Trotsky knew he had to get out of Russia for a while, so he headed off to Finland. The Tsar, knowing that things were getting a little hot, offered to create a consultative assembly, known as the Duma. The liberals, known as the Cadets, under Milyukov, agreed with this offering, something Trotsky was vehemently opposed to, as was Lenin. In a scathing rebuke to Milyukov, Trotsky wrote, quote, such things, Professor, are never achieved with the signing of a parchment. They take place on the street and are achieved through struggle. You are afraid of breaking with the Duma because, to you, this constitutional mirage seems real in the dry and barren desert through which Russian liberalism has been wading. Now, as Rubinstein puts it in his book on Trotsky, quote, the liberals were looking to reform the system. Trotsky was looking to overthrow it. In his eyes, no evolutionary process of change could provide sufficient social justice to satisfy his utopian dream. It was around this time that Trotsky began to understand that his vision needed to be promoted through his takeover of a small newspaper, the Russkaya Gazeta, or Russian Gazette. Its success was phenomenal. As Leon put it, quote, within a few days, the circulation rose from 30,000 to 100,000. A month later, it had reached the 500,000 mark. As Rubinstein again points out in his book, quote, both the Bolshevik Novaya Zhin, or New Life, and the Menshevik Nachalo, or Beginning, enjoyed circulations of more than 50,000. Their publications were supported by wealthy businessmen who accepted the fact that Russia could no longer live as before. The new Russian Prime Minister, Sergei Witte, saw the burgeoning influence Trotsky had as one of the leaders of the St. Petersburg Soviet and his newspaper. Now, Trotsky came back into the country, and in response, Sergei Witte began to impose a new round of censorship. On December 3rd, 1905, the Soviet was surrounded by troops, and the leadership, along with Trotsky, were arrested. Looking back at the 1905 revolution, Trotsky believed that this was merely a dress rehearsal. But it came with a powerful lesson. As he put it, quote, if it was not the opposition of the liberal bourgeoisie, not the elemental rising of the peasantry or the terrorist attacks of the intelligentsia, but the strike of the workers, that for the first time brought Tsarism to its knees. One of the problems that faced both the Mensheviks and Bolsheviks was that Marxism and the revolution that needed to come out of those socialist ideals needed a developed system of capitalism, something that was severely lacking in Russia at the time. From his prison cell, Trotsky was to write a series of articles entitled, quote, "The Balance and the Prospects, the Moving Forces of the Revolution." He had a number of theories on how a socialist revolution by the workers and for the workers could succeed in Russia. One of them was that if the Bolsheviks were successful, they would be met by capitalist nations which would work to destroy the revolution. To counter that, the Russian revolutionaries would have to inspire other revolutions in the more capitalistic European nations, and then they would support Russia. This was the theory of permanent revolution that would thrust Trotsky to the head of the revolutionary movement. His trial, along with the others, would begin on September 19, 1906, with the charges being planning an armed insurrection. Trotsky would take the stand on October 4th. He would make two assertions. One, that the Soviet did indeed plan an insurrection, but it was due to the government and its use of force, like the numerous pogroms that the government turned a blind eye to. Trotsky would tell the court, quote, "What we possess is not a national governmental force, but an automaton for mass murder. I can find no other name for the machine of government that cuts into pieces the living flesh of our people. And if you can tell me that the pogroms, the arson, the violence, if you can tell me that all that has happened in Tver, Rostov, Kursk, Siedlce, if you can tell me that Kishinev, Odessa, Bialystok represented the form of government of the Russian Empire, then yes, then I recognize, together with the prosecution, that in October and November we were arming ourselves against the form of government of the Russian Empire." Even though they had a witness that would prove that the Okhrana, the Russian secret police, had indeed distributed leaflets endorsing the pogroms, the court refused to allow the testimony. Hearing this, the defendants walked out. When the guilty verdict was delivered on November 2nd, it was to an almost empty courtroom. The defendants were sentenced in absentia to Siberia for life. Trotsky would find a way, though, to escape before making it to the final destination of Obdorsk by faking an illness. Now, they sent him to a hospital where he was able to escape, and he was walking hundreds of miles in the dead of winter. Trotsky and his guide would eventually make it to a small town with a train station. Trotsky would find his way to St. Petersburg, where he would gather up his wife and children to head to exile in Finland, where they would meet up with Lenin and Martov. They would stay out of Russia until 1917, when Tsar Nicholas II had abdicated. From there, Trotsky and Lenin would plot their revolution. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Join me next time when we finish up our revisitation of the life of Leon Trotsky. So, until next time, до свидания и спасибо за внимание.